All right, Kevin, back with you for another episode of the $1 Million Relationships Podcast. And today I am here with Jim Nemeth. Jim, welcome. So awesome to have you on the show.
Thanks, Kevin. As Hank Azaria character in Gross Point Blank said, long time, first time.
Yes, yes. And you and I have been sitting here talking for about 30 minutes before we hit the record button. I'm finally like, man, maybe we should record a podcast.
Yeah.
So, I want to start off by giving a shout out to Jessica and the folks, the whole team at the podcast guest. I feel like Jessica, that she's kind of like just, I don't know, she's taken a liking to me or what have you, because she's constantly sending me emails going, hey, Kev, I want to let you know about so and so because I think they'd be a great guest for your podcast. And that's how you and I connected, is because I got an email like that from Jessica.
She does
And
a great job. Just does a great
oh
job.
man, I am, you know what? And she has never steered me wrong. And so I am so appreciative of her and the relationship that we have, and the fact that she just kind of, I guess, likes what I'm doing. And so she just keeps sending me referrals. And so,
Perfect.
and,
Perfect.
when we get connected through a source like that, at least for me, Jim, when you and I started talking today, even though this was the first time you and I have ever spoke or met, I felt like I'd known you for years because of how we got connected. And that whole thing just speaks volumes about the value of relationships, which is what this podcast is all about.
100%. And that's one of the reasons, Kevin, you and I talked briefly about that. There are a lot of podcasts out there. There's a lot of entrepreneurs, but putting those two variables together and coming away with something with such high utility of this idea of what relationships truly mean.
Yeah.
And without that, you if you're lucky enough to be a billionaire and you can buy your relationships, that's fine. I think we're talking about 1% of 1% there. But for the rest of us who are trying to be entrepreneurs or trying to lead businesses, being CEOs, COOs, whatever it is, understanding as quickly as you possibly can that without good relationships, it's going to be a tough pull. And
Totally.
and and bless you if you can get there on your own.
Yeah,
But
right. Well, what I'd like to do is kind of start off. I want to turn it over to you, Jim, so that we can set a little bit of context for our listeners. And I want to have you share, about what you do, who you serve, what inspires you most about the work you do and the impact you guys are making. And we'll just start there to set a little bit of context.
thanks, Kevin. I mean, I'm a healthcare CEO, but I also had kind of this shadow career in improvisation, starting out as a student and later on as a director and a producer and doing my own shows. And it really starts back in Michigan, where I grew up. My dad was an accountant and he got sick. And one of the things I tell everybody, I remember going into Wahlburgers and they had welfare cheese as a cheese selection on the menu. And I remember eating welfare cheese as a kid.
Mm-hmm.
Shout out to Mark Wahlberg for making something that you could view as something negative as something that was positive. I told my kids, I said, order that cheese. You'll really like it. So it was my brother, myself, my mom and dad, and this is when they used to, Kevin, they would keep you in the hospital for 6, 8 months. I mean, this was the late 70s, early
Okay.
80s. And so my dad would spend, 6 months in a hospital. Anyways, we got super poor. They'd already shut off our lights, our phone, and they were going to shut off our water. And I remember just thinking about, like, how can you shut someone's water off? I mean, isn't that like a public health issue? Anyways, my brother and I went out at a little 800 square foot house, went in a living room, and he said, listen, one of us is going to have to go in the military to keep the family afloat, and the other person needs to go to college and get a degree, and we need to sort of tag team this. And he said, so we're going to do it fair. We're going to flip a coin. So he flipped a coin. I called heads. It was tails. I went into the Army as a medic, and he went to U of M for a business degree. So I came out after serving some active duty, and you and I talked about. Thank you for serving, Kevin, too. And I started out in Detroit at Old Grace Hospital, which was famous for where Harry Houdini had died. He was performing over in Canada, And he had this backstage act he kind of did, like you could punch him in the stomach. And there was a big farm boy that hit him. He wasn't ready for it, burst his appendix. He got septic infection. They brought him over there and he passed away in the hospital. So I came to work in the emergency department there, and it was great because every Halloween, we would have this group that would come and hang around the hospital and do seances trying to contact Harry Houdini.
Gosh.
But we what I was introduced to was this generation of healthcare providers who this was before CAT scans and MRIs and all these fancy blood work tests and everything. These were clinicians who grew up in the 60s and 70s and 50s. They put stethoscopes on patients. They listened to things, and I really fell in love with this idea of working with people that were practicing the science of medicine, but in a way they were artists, the nurses, the doctors. This was this vanishing generation, and I knew, I wanted to be a part of that somehow. How could I sort of make it easier for them? So, I went, got my nursing degree, became a trauma nurse, and really had a really, an aha moment when I was asked to join management. And I remember just thinking, that's the last thing I ever want to do. I don't want to be on that side of it. It was like, you're enlisted, you want to be an officer, et cetera, et cetera. And when I started leadership, I really felt kind of lost. Um, I think that I had a good idea of clinically how to do things, but I was seeing people around me, Kevin, that were successful in their careers, and other people that were kind of not being successful, maybe on their way down, missing opportunities. And this just wasn't just my colleagues in the hospital. These were physician leaders, C-suite executives as well, and this commonality of like what was making people successful. And this is where you and I kind of touched on this. It was this idea of, I sort of figured it out early in my career that it was about relationships, about this idea of how do you work with people? How do you get people to get on board? I think in my TED Talk, which I did a few years ago, entitled "Improv Your Business," I think I threw out a statistic that Ford said that only 10% of people get fired for incompetence. The other 90% is because people don't like you. And I think I said in my TED Talk, I hope after my TED Talk, if you get fired, it's not it's because you're incompetent.
You're incompetent. Yeah.
Not that people like you. So about this time, what I was not it wasn't, this education wasn't coming through university, and it wasn't necessarily coming through experience for me. Like, how do I figure out this relationship component to it? And like a lot of people, I always liked, Saturday Night Live and, Dan Aykroyd and John Belushi and, a lot of things in entertainment, a lot of things you see on stage are people in relationships and you like them. And so I had an opportunity to take a class at the Second City. And that's where really I started. It was sort of my Rosetta Stone for relationship building.
Okay.
Like, it was taking the corporate language and it was translating it into theater language. And then it was translating it into sort of a amalgamation of the two. And I started to see things that, initially I think everybody gets, and in my book, Improv Your Business, improvisational skills for the corporate stage. The first half of my book is really about like the history of improv, of the easy rules. Yes and, we've all heard that. So many people use that now, and that's a great thing. Don't deny and don't ask questions. And then I kind of summarize those three first chapters into something I call the history of improv. And that really sort of sets the stage. And I think it's a good primer. And I think that, 90% of people kind of get there on their own. They pick up some of that here and there. They're able to make the jokes. They're able to listen. They can do some things. But really, the second part of the book focuses on, how those rules of improvisation can work on the corporate stage. And that second part of the book really focuses on three elements: who, what, and where. The where is just basically your location, Kevin. Where are you in your job? Where are you in your relationships at home? If you're not where you want to be, then you need a plan and you need to start developing that. The second part of it was the what, and those are independent and dependent activities. So, Kevin, right now, you and I are in a dependent activity. We're having a podcast where we're talking back and forth. And just if anybody's out there, they want to audition for the Second City loves for you to do dependent things on stage. They like you to hand imaginary cups of coffee to each other because the audience sees that working relationship, that cooperation, that collaboration, even though it's made up, that dependent activity is so important. An independent activity is just, a monologue. It's a person doing a single podcast. It's you at work. 90% probably of what most people do during their day is, independent activities. It's that 10% when they have the opportunity to go into the meeting, to be a part of the committees, to do all that. That's where the high stakes of the relationship comes. And then the last one, really, Kevin, is the who, and that's where I break it down. If it's like if you picked up my book and you only had 2 hours to read it, just go to the chapter that's entitled Who, because it basically breaks it down to three things: an inner want, an implied status, and an identifiable relationship. And that is the key to good characters. It's key to a good performance. It's a key to a good executive. It's a key to a good entrepreneur. If you can do that, if you can have those identifiable relationships, if you can work with people's inner wants and you can understand the status component, then I think that, you all you need to do is just hard work from that point.
Yeah.
You have those pieces that you need. So really, at the end of the day, for me, writing the book was about this 30-year career in healthcare, 20-year career in improvisation. And like you, I just want people to understand the importance of the relationship component, because I've seen so many talented people fail, whether they were entrepreneurs, whether they were corporate executives, just because they could not get their head wrapped around the relationship part of what it means to be successful.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. You packed a whole lot in there. And, especially in the, I look at my own journey, excuse me, and my own growth process, just getting where we are right here, right now. I just celebrated my 59th birthday last week on the 26th. And I feel at 59 years old, Jim, I'm just now really starting to figure stuff out, and and this whole thing of, just finding out and discovering not only my own God-given gifts and how to use them effectively, but then also who I'm most valuable to.
Oh
And
yeah. Oh yes. Yes. Yeah.
figuring those two things out and getting alignment there. Once I figured that out, it was like, wow, look at
Right.
what's happening now.
Well, Kevin, there's two things that jump in my head. One is, I heard a quote that says, we wouldn't be alive past 50 without pharmacology and technology. And if you think about, the average age of humans for the longest time was 30 some years, they never got to where you and I are.
Yeah,
They never got to that point where you're late 50s and you can look back and, wisdom is the application of knowledge, and having that ability to sort of do that. The other thing is that, they used to say, well, people did their best, all the super geniuses, Mozart and Einstein and all these did their best work in their 20s. And it's like, yeah, I think if you only lived to 30, I think you had to do your best work in your 20s.
yeah,
But you're right. I mean, at the end of the day, we've been gifted with time, which is the most precious thing. I'll always argue that. I've seen very successful people, and at the end of the day, running an acute care hospital and walking into a room, and whether you're a homeless person or you live in a 20,000 square foot mansion, you're laying in that hospital bed looking up at those, little ceiling tiles, and it's the great equalizer. And at
yeah,
the end, it's how well have you utilized your time
yeah,
that you've been gifted. And that's, you and I talked about that, Kevin. One of the things that attracted me to your podcast is that I think that there's a tongue-in-cheek component of people thinking about relationships. Like it's like, yeah, relationships, a good suit, a nice car and everything. And it's like, no, I mean, without that, the path is a three-car funeral. I mean, you're not going to have um you're not going to have what you truly want out of life, and that is people that care about you and people that care about your success and people that also care about your failures.
Yeah.
So couldn't
Yeah.
agree with you more.
Yeah. Well, now that we've got a little bit of context set here, I'm gonna switch gears and I'm gonna reiterate the question for the benefit of our listeners. And so, Jim, have you ever been introduced to a person or persons who completely changed the course of your life or your business, so much so that much of what you have today would not be possible if not for this person or persons? And I'm just really excited to hear your story and your experience around this topic of relationships.
Yeah, and thank you for the ability to exercise the discipline of choosing one. And you and I talked a little bit about that. It's difficult, but it should be. So for me, um, there's one person that just stands out that really changed the paradigm of everything that I thought I knew about being successful and also helping me establish a very clear vision. And that person is Sharna Halpern.
Okay.
And a lot of people may not know who Sharna is, but I will tell you there's a lot of people that that would probably pick Sharna as well. Sharna was the co-founder with Del Close of the Improv Olympic in Chicago.
Okay.
And she has been the mentor to Chris Farley and Tim Meadows and Amy Poehler and Tina Fey. And you can go down the list of just, everybody thinks it's Lorne Michaels at Saturday Night Live. And Lorne does a great job, but he gets his people from people. And
Mm-hmm.
really, Sharna was her theater in Chicago. There was the Second City Theater, but there was the Improv Olympic. And what Sharna did, she there were so many things that I learned from her. So how did I get to Chicago? So a buddy of mine, Steve Malosi, and I were taking classes, like I said in the very beginning at Detroit Second City, and we had a teacher, Joshua Funk, who later went on to Mad TV and things like that. But he said, listen, if you're really going to do this, you need to go to Chicago. That's where you learn improv. And I said, hey, listen, I'm a manager in healthcare. I got kids. I'm 30 years old. I'm not out there looking to, score a spot on Saturday Night Live. And he said, no, well, if you're serious about the art, you have to go learn it from the people that really have been teaching it and know it. And I didn't disagree with him. So we climbed to my green Dodge Caravan minivan, and we drove to Chicago and signed up for classes at the Improv Olympic. And level one, Sharna taught that. And what I know about Sharna was at the time that she was a Chicago native. She went to Columbia College, I believe, and she came out and she was a casting director. And to this day, I always tell everybody, your human resources is your casting director. I see too many CEOs trying to make hiring decisions, and the reason you have a casting director is because they specialize in identifying talent, right? Then the executives, once the talented people are there, then they need to indoctrinate them into their culture, et cetera, et cetera. But she was a casting director. And then what she did is she met Del Close. And Del was one of those mad geniuses. He struggled with mental health issues and drug addiction, but he had this sort of pure sense of what you need to do in order to entertain an audience. And
Okay.
so she started to take care of Dell because Dell was like, I don't know, Kevin, if you've experienced this, like truly talented people really kind of suffer. They're the people that we see in movies and television and on stage and everything, I rank them and, this could get me in trouble, but they're usually like 8 out of 10 out of pure talent. They're 9 out of 10. The 10 out of 10s never make it to the stage. They never get to the film. They're never successful because that consuming component of their talent, makes it so that they're late all the time or they don't establish good relationships. But when they're on the stage, there's nobody better. So
Yeah.
Dell was that person. He was a true pure talent, but he couldn't do anything with it. I mean, if you're in a show and then you don't show up and you get fired, and how do you teach people? So what Sharna did, and when I started to learn from her very quickly, was is that, like, not only was Sharna there to look at the students that were coming along in order to see if there was talent there that you could work with and move along their careers so that they could be on Saturday Night Live or Mad TV or whatever. She was running this education program, almost like a college of comedy. And so she had to have instructors, and she had to have classes, and she had to have this discipline in order to teach this. And she had to keep Dell alive and keep Dell teaching and keep him on track. So, here's Sharna. She's a teacher herself, but she's running a college. She's also the significant other to somebody who is a handful. But now she's running a super high level comedy improv theater in Chicago, right next to Wrigley Field. So all those zoning things that you need to know, and all these regulations and everything. And she's got a bar in there that she has to run as well. So here's this person that's multitasking, and Kevin, like, she was great at everything. Like, she was great as being Dell's partner. She was great at teaching. She was great when she was a performer. She was great making sure that the bar ran well. She was great keeping her theater open. She was great at teaching and inspiring people. And I'm looking at myself and going, like, I think I'm pretty good at one thing, but there's no way. So what happened was, is that first level of being with Sharna, she just really, we just had this, I just feel we had a very strong connection. The choices that I was taking, maybe as an older improviser, I wasn't there to get a job or something. So when I went up on stage, she has a book called Truth and Comedy. And that was really going on stage and playing these truthful characters. And because of my background, I had maybe more diverse experiences than some of the younger performers. And she came and approached me and she said, "Hey, listen, Jim, I want to put you on stage." And I was like, "Oh, Sharna, I got to talk to my wife. I mean, that's I'm driving one day a week to Chicago in my minivan. That would be 2 days a week." She goes, "Well, it'd actually be 3 days a week." Um, and so she started me thinking about the possibilities of being competent and capable at the more than just one thing. I wanted to be a competent and capable healthcare leader. I wanted to be a competent and capable father and husband and friend. But this idea that you could do something else, and seeing that she could do that and did it so well. And that really started to accelerate things for me, because her confidence in my ability to do more than just the one thing I thought I was going to be good at. I thought I was going to be good as a healthcare executive. I worked hard for that. But at the age of 30, to start something new and different, and then have somebody who was such an expert saying, "Jim, you're one of my favorite improvisers. This is something that you can do. You need to do it." And just started this whole idea of learning this other craft. And then that's, Kevin, where I started to see the picture come together of, like, wow, I can use this at work. I mean, that's what I had hoped. I had hoped that I could get through the yes and the don't deny part of the improv, but really that identifiable relationship of, and I think that's the thing that Sharna saw most in my early performances, is that she could look at what I was trying to do on stage, and she could identify with that relationship. She could say, "I know who that person is. That's a person that I like. That reminds me of a friend of mine." And I think that in the corporate world, when I see people struggle, is that they have these relationships that they can't be defined. I always, try to help out my VPs or my directors and tell them, "Look, if you're having problems with a relationship, write down who this person reminds you of. Is it at the bully on the playground? Is it your best friend?" And if there are things that are negative in there, you have to kind of start doing that work, because if you can't get to that level where you can work with somebody that you need to, based on where your status is in an organization. I don't know about you, Kevin, but I've had bosses that were terrible, just awful people, but they had the status in the organization, and they were going to be able to do what they needed to do. So it was up to me to change that. How do I change my status? Focus on the relationship. And I
Yeah.
don't mean becoming somebody that you're not or saying yes to evil, but I had a boss one time, all she wanted to do was play golf on Wednesdays. I mean, that was her inner want. That's what she truly wanted to do. And I made sure I did everything I can to provide her with the opportunity to go play golf on Wednesdays.
Mm-hmm.
And our relationship, turned 180 degrees after that because I was able to fulfill that inner want. And then we could identify the relationship that we had. And then we started working on status after that. So
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's really phenomenal because you're right. When we do find out what is most important to other people and figure out how we can best support them in that, I mean, my gosh, I mean, we create so much relationship capital so quickly just by showing up that way for the people in our lives that we care about, and that's
and it's
phenomenal.
truly the entrepreneur spirit is figuring out your customer's inner want.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's where I started to see this beauty behind these rules of improvisation. From there I was fortunate to be selected to study at the Second City Conservatory, and that's really where they teach you that they break it down to you, and the nuts and bolts component of that. And I remember doing an exercise, and I said to one of my instructors, I believe he had served some time as a writer on Seinfeld, but I said, what happens when I fulfill my scene partner's inner want? And he said, well, you give them another one, and I really think that that's the entrepreneur spirit of like, if you want a laptop on every single person's desk is what your goal is, they've got to do something with that laptop. So the first inner want is getting that laptop on their desk, Bill Gates. And then the next thing is, developing programs that people can utilize and games and the rest of that. If Bill Gates had just stopped at that first inner want and just saying like, I just want to make sure that everybody has a laptop on there, we'd have laptops sitting there, but we wouldn't be utilizing them.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's important.
Yeah. Totally. Totally. If you look back at your relationship with Sharna, and so I want you to, and I'm sure you could probably come up with a number of examples of this, but what is an example of a situation where you personally uh, got to make a really substantial impact where even you were like, man, wow, that was really powerful. And you also know that would have never happened if not for the relationship that you had with Sharna.
Yeah, I had mentioned Dell Close, and in my book, I actually talk about you can go on YouTube. He decided that he was going to withdraw his medication that I believe he had really bad emphysema and COPD, and he had just made the decision he wasn't going to continue. And they had a funeral for him, and Bill Murray was there, and it's on YouTube. And he did die a day or two after that was filmed. And this was Sharna's friend, mentor, and somebody that she had cared for years. And she was still showing up at the theater teaching. And we had heard that Dell was in the hospital. Now that's what I did for a living, Kevin. I worked in hospitals. I was at bedsides when people died alone in the emergency department. And I just felt this enormous emotional empathy for her, where here she is sitting in the front row of her theater trying to get us knucklehead first level students to make it through these exercises. And what had happened, it was I don't know what you call it. I don't know why it happened, but like I said, Steve Malosi and I, he every once in a while we would get a chance to perform together, even though we drove from Michigan, Detroit to Chicago. You didn't always get a chance to play with each other on stage and scenes because you're in a class and they break you up and everything. And what had happened is we went out in the scene, and the scene was going to be a time jump. So we were going to meet at 20 years old and then 40 years old and then at 60 years old. And we went out on stage, and for some reason, Steve just chose that he was a wounded soldier. Well, Kevin, you and I talked about this. I went into the Army medic thing real quick. So I'm there with him, patching him up, telling him I'm going to get him home and everything. And that scene kind of went. And then other people got to do their 20-year partner scenes. And then we had to come back on stage and do scenes while we were 40 and 60. Well, for some reason, our third scene, we found ourselves that Steve was terminally ill in bed. And I had, instead of being an army medic, I had went on to medical school and became a doctor, and we had become friends. And I was at his bedside in the scene, and just he didn't want to go on. And I told him, there's nothing more I can do for you except let you go. And I just could hear Sharna in the front row just, reacting to that emotionally. And I had always thought years later that maybe that provided some opportunity for her to manage that grief that she was going through, to see it sort of played out on stage in front of her. And like I said, it wasn't intentional. We just found our way into that scene. But I think afterwards, you know, her and I were able to communicate at a very different level, because I think that she had that opportunity to sort of see that play out, and none of that would have happened without my relationships with Steve, to take turns driving to Chicago, to that introduction with Sharna, with her relationship with Dell. It really brought everything together for, 90 seconds or 120 seconds on a stage in Chicago, on a Tuesday afternoon, where somebody's relationship that was so meaningful to them, that she could see part of that hopefully played out in a way that could give her an opportunity to, whether it was to grieve or prepare herself. And I remember her being very thankful for that scene, and
Yeah.
it was a very powerful thing for
Yeah.
us.
Wow. I mean, I could just feel every bit of that as you're sharing that experience. And, I know before we hit the record button, I was sharing with you that, how when I started hosting this podcast, I had this vision and I was like, I'm just going to interview everybody and have them talk about their one most valuable relationship. And sometimes that's appropriate for people and feels totally right. And sometimes it doesn't. And I learned, really early on for me to just show up and be me, and let the conversations go where they will, and just set the intention that I want to have a conversation here, and this conversation that we get to put out there into the world and share with other entrepreneurs, founders, and CEOs, that the intention is to make the biggest impact we possibly can, not to steer it in a certain way. For me, who is this, I used to be really focused on strategy and tactics. How
Hmm.
do you do something, and being really intentional that way, and to just let go of some of that, and to just let it be, and watch the magic that unfolds from that. And it's like been such an amazing experience over the last few years. And it's got me to the point where it's like, man, this is pretty amazing. And I just want to facilitate a whole lot more of this, you know.
No,
And
and very appreciative, because we talked about that as well, because like a lot of your guests, you're going to get multiple requests to do things, and sometimes there are podcasters who are just doing a persona,
yeah,
and they admit that, and it's like, there's utility to that, there's entertainment, but I really think the heart and soul of what you're trying to do, and which I identified with so strongly, is this idea of relationships. And you've got to become good at that if you're going to be long-term successful, and not just finance, not just your own personal wealth, but and I used the terminology before, it's this idea of a three-car funeral.
yeah,
It's you can have all this wealth and this perceived success, but if there's no one there to share it with you, there's no one there to validate that. And we're all not perfect when it comes to what our relationships are, but just being thoughtful of knowing that is a skill that you can continue to develop,
yeah,
that it's something to keep sharp, because it does help you with identifying people's inner wants.
yeah,
It does help you identify the status within an organization, even your own. Even if you're the head of an organization, there's still status. If you have colleagues and you have employees, there's still status there.
yeah,
And that relationship builds you, helps you understand what that is. And knowing that sometimes status has to flip. Sometimes you have to take a step back and let somebody else make those decisions because you need to bring along those successors. You need to bring along people that are going to, run the company. We could say everything we want about Steve Jobs. I mean, Apple is moving forward. Is it the company that it was when he was there? I don't know.
Yeah.
But I know that Bill Gates hasn't gotten to the point where he's technically, maybe he has left a successor, but the status component is important because if it's just a one man band and then you're done, then your company's probably going to have a very difficult time. And it goes back to the ability to maintain relationships and make sure that people understand that that's what's important in your organization.
Yeah. Amen. Amen. Well, Jim, for anybody that's listening to this going, man, Kev, I really like Jim. I love the way that he shows up, and I just really appreciate some of the stuff. How can they find out more about you, the work you're doing? I mean, any resources, any websites, anything you want to share with them?
I always start with everybody. I have a TED talk called Improv Your Business. It is on YouTube. I did that years ago. That's a good primer of my work. TED gives you 30 minutes. It was interesting. I was the first speaker in the second segment. If you've ever been to a TED talk or TEDx talks, they have them in three segments, and you try to be in the second segment because that's where they have status at TED, whether you believe it or not. But there was a little bit of a delay when I went out on stage, and when I looked at my TED clock, it was at 22 minutes. Like TED doesn't care. Like you get 30 minutes, and if there was a 7-minute technical delay, you have to cut or cram everything. So my
Oh,
TED Talk's 22 minutes if you see it. So start there. My book's on Amazon and Kindle, Improv Your Business. It's the same title as the TED Talk there. And then, as far as getting in contact with me, a real simple email, planetimprov at Hotmail.
I
And you
love
and I
that.
talked. Yeah, we had
And
that
you've
for
had
quite
that
some time.
email for years.
Years, decades. So
Awesome. Well, I just want to make sure and give you any last thing that you feel led to share, Jim, before we call it a wrap.
I just want to wrap it up with Kevin that, I talked about that coin flip with my brother. And, it was 40 years later, we were having Thanksgiving dinner, and I was relaying that story to my children and my family, and my brother was there. And he said, Jim, it was heads.
Oh,
Um, so,
wow.
so, so a relationship lesson is always check the coin flip visually because I don't, I don't, I don't hold anything against him. It put me on a great path. Wonderful relationships, so many mentors, so many coaches, so many guides in my career in healthcare and in the theater. It all started with that coin flip. I had won it, but I guess I won it in a very different way.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
my
yeah.
brother and I hugged after that, and no hard feelings. But that's a great example of relationships for me.
Absolutely. That's a great example. Well, Jim, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation today, to share from your heart. And I am just like really excited to get this out and share it with a lot of other entrepreneurs because I know how impactful this is going to be. So thank you so much again. Really appreciate it. Really appreciate you.
And thank you, Kevin, for what you're doing. Keep at it, my friend. Keep planting those seeds. Uh, Keep making people understand the importance of relationships because at the end of the day, that's what's going to get people to
Yeah,
their goals. It's gonna keep that focus there, and you're gonna have so much more appreciable happiness um, if you continue to work in that direction. So thank you for the
absolutely.
work you're doing.
Absolutely.